Okay, our first lecture is on families as systems. So when we say, what do we mean when we say the family is a system? Before getting there, we have to think about what is a family. And we have to make a distinction between thinking of the family as a system versus other ways of thinking about the family. And so when we say what is a family, we can think of, well, how do you define it? And there's two kinds of definitions that we could come up. One is what we might call an institutional definition, and the other is what we'd call an analytical definition. And they're both, in the sense that they're definitions, they're both constructions of a sort. Like, there is nothing that's in reality a family, right? Mm-hmm. Everything is a construction. It's the way that humans make sense of what's in their world. And so there's two kinds of groups that we're concerned about when we think about the family definition as a construction. One is, we might call it the family as a social construction, which is how a society thinks about what a family is and how it creates family in its day-to-day life. And we'd call that the institutional definition of a family. And the other is how social scientists think about a family. And so that's a group of people who are part of a scientific discipline, who are interested in answering certain kinds of questions about groups. And so they construct an idea of what it is, the subject matter that they study. Okay? And we're going to be more concerned about the latter than the former. But to kind of give you a little bit more background on the two types, let's look first at what an institutional definition is. An institutional definition is based on the realities of everyday life as shaped by individuals in the same society trying to survive and adapt to their environments. So you live in a particular society at a particular point in time. There's certain environmental conditions of life that you have to adapt to. You have certain tools available, certain technologies that make it possible, some things more or less possible to do. And that then changes the way you organize your day-to-day life. If you, for example, if you're a farmer, if you don't have massive corporate farms and a private marketplace, well, you can spend most of your day tilling fields and planting and harvesting, etc., and it's going to be labor intensive, etc. And so you're going to create a family system that's different than a family in an industrial society where you don't have to farm your own goods. You're going off to work in a separate place rather than working around your house where their farms are, etc. And so you're going to change the way you operate in your day-to-day life. And so that's going to essentially define how you construct your families. Now, there's certain of these things are, these technologies available and the kinds of environments we're adapting to make certain kinds of forms of family more or less likely to occur, but we also have other dynamics that change what that family looks like. For example, who has power in the society. They're going to want to shape the family in a particular way as well to their advantage. So for example, in most societies, we have patriarchal family organizations. Men kind of make all the decisions. Well, why? Well, because at some point in time, men gained power over women in society, and this allowed them then, when new conditions changed, they were able to influence the adaptation in a way that they got all the good stuff, and the people without the power, namely women and children, got all the kind of crummy stuff, all the leftovers that didn't yield more power. And so that sustained their position and their privilege in society. So different aspects of our day-to-day life, both the kinds of environments and technologies we have to use to adapt to our environments, and the power structures of the society are going to shape what families look like at any particular time in any particular place. And so as we kind of work this through, interacting with people, as women interact with men and they find that they don't have the ability to get the men to do the things that they don't want to do, they wind up doing those things, and the men go do those other things, and gradually you get these patterns that everybody is finding this is the reality. All these women are finding the same reality because power is structured in societies, right? And so as all these women start doing the same thing and all these men do these different things, that's a pattern. And that becomes reality. And so when young children are born and they're raised within that society, they don't have to figure it out for themselves. It's already presented to them as this is how it works. And so they fall into the same pattern. And it only changes usually only changes if the conditions of life change, like the Industrial Revolution, for example. And so that changes the conditions of life, which then make it possible for the individuals in the society to alter the ways in which they organize themselves in families and change the nature of family life. And so as individuals develop patterns of action and reaction towards each other, these patterns become expectations and take on the characteristics of reality for those living them out. And so not only do you think that this is reality, but you kind of expect that if you're the man, you're going to do these things, and if you're the woman, you're going to do these things. That's just gender, right? Or if you're the firstborn, here's the things you do, and here's your expectations, and here's where you're going in life. If you're the latter-borns, and you do these other things. And so people, as they develop the new patterns, they then develop expectations that reinforce the patterns, so that then the expectations aren't just for each other's, for the other person's behaviors to conform with the pattern, but we actually use those same expectations for ourselves. How should I expect myself to act? And that's the basis for our actions going forward. So these institutional definitions are very variable from society to society. What's a family in an agricultural society is a lot different than what's a family in an industrial society. Just as one example. Different from a hunting and gathering society. What's a family in Mexico is different than what's a family in the United States. Different places in the United States will define the family differently. Lots depending upon how they've worked out these arrangements over time, given their environments, their technologies, and the power structures that exist within them. So they're not very useful for social scientists to say, well, this is a functional family. A functional family is anything that looks like this, has this structure, and operates along these guidelines. Who says, well, maybe in a different society, it's a functional family is something different. So if we wanted to come up with an idea of what makes a family work as a system, these definitions aren't very useful. They're useful for understanding how societies are organized, but they're not useful to understanding what kinds of internal dynamics makes families more functional or less. And so we're not going to use them. They are not the subject matter of this course. So that's all I'm going to talk about institutional definitions. We're going to drop it by the wayside. We're going to try to think of families in a more abstract way, regardless of whether it's in this society or that society, whether it's extended or nuclear, or whether it's polygamous or monogamous, it doesn't matter to us. We're going to say, if a family, what are the principles that make a family work, regardless of how it's structured in a society? Okay? And though that's going to then require an analytical definition. So analytical definitions are based on the needs of sociologists to distinguish one type of group from another and to help identify important aspects of group dynamics that explain group functioning and survival. So what's a family from a sociological perspective? Well, a family is a multi-generational group. That's kind of important because it says that when we act in our families, we're thinking about either some other generation that's going to come along as children, and when we act in our families, we're going to have to deal with the influences of a previous generation. That's always going to be there, and that's unique to families. Other groups don't have that. Families are unique in the sense that they don't accomplish just one kind of thing. They don't attempt, for example, they don't just do some instrumental thing, like accomplish work, right? So a study group is not a family because it just does one thing. It helps people prepare to take a test. It really isn't designed to help people deal with their emotional lives or develop their identities in the world. Well, families do both of these kinds of things. They do instrumental kinds of things, and they also do emotional kinds of things, which makes them more complex and more difficult to operate as groups, right? Because when you want to achieve something, you can't just think of getting the tasks done efficiently. because sometimes getting the task done efficiently means you have to step on somebody's toes, right? Someone's going to get emotional. And you can't just, at work, the boss can say, if you can't put the emotions beside, you're out of here. Family can't say that. Families are responsible also for the emotional sides of life. And so the ways in which they operate are going to be different than the ways in which any other group operates. And so this emotional and instrumental functionality of families is also distinguishing. And then the third thing that distinguishes them, and these aren't on the overheads, a third thing that distinguishes them is this idea that they have a history, that they have a duration to them, and a high level of interdependence. Families exist over time. The members are tied to each other with an implicit and sometimes explicit understanding that this is going to go on into the future, and that there will be responsibilities that go on into the future, that you can't just be easily cut off. Right? Now you can cut off, but that's a real drastic kind of thing, because families have the expectation of duration. They also have very high levels of interdependency. People organize their lives in relationship to other family members. And one family member can't do something without impacting the other family members in many, many different ways. And so that high level of interdependency also makes them unique from other kinds of groups. Having said that, for our purposes, when we look at the family as a system, we're going to focus on three dimensions of that system. One is, the first component is the functional component. So we think of families as having a purpose and goals that define their existence and shape their activities. So families are trying to accomplish something. And the two things, there's two general groups of things they're trying to accomplish. One is dealing with the emotional needs of their members and dealing with accomplishing certain kinds of tasks, instrumental tasks. Those tasks might be related to the needs of the members, like we want our child to achieve success in the world. And so we're going to socialize that child to succeed in the world. Right? Or we might want to get a new house. So how are we going to organize ourselves to make money and save money in a way and allocate our resources in a way that allows us to save money to buy a house or a new car or a washing machine? Those are instrumental kinds of goals. They're things that we want. That's usually we decide amongst ourselves is what we want to achieve. Some of these instrumental goals come from society. So society says, well, you're a family, you have to do that. You have to make sure that your child learns the rules of society. So sometimes the instrumental goals are dictated by the society. They're not voluntarily created by the members. Make sense? Emotionally, most of that is the needs of members. So most of those goals are coming internally. The second component is the structural component. And this refers to established and repeated patterns of behavior that often become reified in sets of mutually agreed upon expectations. Reified, made real. We come to think of it, this is what we're about. So every family develops its own patterns. Yeah, there'll be some commonality for families in the same situation, in the same society, but there'll also be innovations. Right? And so what are those patterns of behavior? So think of your own families. Think about the ways in which you interact with your other family members. Do you see any patterning to that over time? Do you see that, whenever you're with this person, you do these kinds of things? Or you don't do these kinds of things? How much do you talk to your mother versus your father? What kinds of things do you talk about with your mother versus your father or your siblings, right? And so those are patterns. If I only talk about certain kinds of things with mom and not those kinds of things with dad, that's a pattern. My behavior is predictable, right? Ultimately, when we say there's a pattern, we're saying the behaviors are predictable. We know what's going to happen. As those patterns develop, they actually become in our heads expectations. having problems with money. I better go talk to Dad, because he expects that I should ask him about money. Okay? And so those expectations come about. Sometimes we learn them, but most of the time we develop them, and then we give meaning to them. And then third is the cultural components. Systems of meanings and identities that develop as group members try to make sense of their day-to-day lives and their patterns of interaction. What are we about as a family? We might be a dysfunctional family. That might be our thing. We're a freestyle family. We're a military, rigid family. We can think of ourselves and we can actually come up with reasons why we organize ourselves that way. We do it because we're very religious and we follow the principles of God or whatever. And so we give meaning to who we are and what we're about. And that's the cultural element of family life. And it's kind of an important one. Sometimes we do things that have no relationship to achieving anything. We simply do them because they sustain our family meanings, make us feel like we are a family. You know, we might be going through difficult times and everybody's going in different directions. But you know what? Every single day we sit down together at the dinner table for supper. And when we sit there in a particular location relative to the other members. And we pass the food a particular way. Right? We might even play with our food in particular ways. Right? I always remember when I was broccoli, we'd always sit there as kids and we'd stick the broccoli in the mashed potatoes to make forests. A crazy kind of thing. We did every time we had mashed potatoes and broccoli. And we looked at each other doing it and we joked about it and it was fun. It was like it was ritualized. Or we prayed every day before we ate. Okay? And there was one person that did the prayer. Or we were in a family in which the prayer got sent around in a particular pattern. What did that accomplish? What did that accomplish? Probably nothing in terms of, achieving a particular goal, other than maybe making us all feel like we're together. We're a unit. And that sense of being a unit with a particular identity oftentimes is important in holding a family together when things get difficult. Oftentimes when families get into difficult problems, they fall back on those rituals. And so that's the cultural element. And we'll talk about that later in later part in the course when we talk about cultures of families. Also part of the cultural is our own individual identities in that family. So who am I in my family? I'm different than who I am in this classroom. I'm different than just being someone's son or someone's brother. I was just home visiting my mom and my sisters back in New Hampshire. And, I get back there, I'm Ricky. I'm kind of like still little Ricky. I'm 60 years old. I'm still kind of little Ricky. Right? I can't shake that. I'm still mom's favorite. I'm not her favorite. Well, maybe I am. I don't know why. But that's my identity. And when I go back there, sometimes you don't want to go back. Because you might be somebody different. And when you go back there, you're that person again. Unless you can negotiate it. And it's really hard. That's why lots of people, when they go back home for holidays can be very stressful. Because these people have been away and they've developed a different identity. And then they come back into their family and they get sucked right into being that person that was the last person that was there before they left. And that can be really stressful. It can be really hard to shake that. It's probably when you go off to school, when you go off to college and you go back and visit old friends from college, or you go to a reunion 30 years later, or a high school reunion or something. It feels weird, right? Because you had an identity in that context. Well, imagine that you have this identity all the time in this family context, because the family keeps on going on and on and on, and you're always interacting with them. All right, so that's what we mean by the cultural component. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each here. Functional components of families. The first principle here is that families regulate interactions to achieve goals. Okay? Families function for something. And the thing they function for is achieving goals. Now, there are different kinds of goals. Some of those are constructed based on cultural values and mutual interests. We want to buy a house. Society says we need to make sure our children learn the rules and grow up to be functioning adults, take their part in society, be good citizens, etc. Achieve an educational degree. Those are constructed goals. They're specific to the society in which we live, or even the social group within which we live. So some families, a very strong goal is to make sure their kids get a college education. Other families could care less about whether they get a college education. Want to get a job, find a spouse, get married. Whatever that goal is, it ranges, it differs from family to family. The other kind of goal are what we call systemic. And these are things that families have to do in order to continue to exist. So they're like I don't know what sustains their vitality as a unit. We can think of these systemic goals as what keeps a cell, a biological cell, alive, what allows it to survive, what makes your lung work, your lungs work, what's necessary. Think of the family the same way. Family's an organism. What does it need in order to survive? So not just what does it need to achieve the goals that it sets for itself, but what does it need to just survive and adapt to situations that it encounters. Families accomplish tasks derived from their goals. So if you have certain goals, then you set up certain tasks that have to be achieved along the way to attain those goals. Systems theorists distinguish between what they call first-order tasks and second-order tasks. The first-order tasks have mostly to do with achieving goals. The second-order tasks have more to do with adaptation. So first-order tasks are related to ongoing activities to achieve goals. Some of them that are more around constructed goals are coordinated activities to effectively and efficiently attain outcomes. So let's say one of your constructed goals is to make sure your son fits in at school and achieves on the athletic field because you believe that athletics is good or whatever. That's one of your goals. So how do we organize ourselves so Johnny or Janie can achieve in soccer? Okay, well, soccer, you got to go to practice. You got to go to practice. That means you're probably going to have to reorganize dinner time. You're probably going to have to change bedtimes and when people do homework and things of that nature. So you have to organize yourselves so that you can make it possible for Johnny to achieve. My neighbor where I live here in my Bellingham home here, they have a daughter who is an ice skater and a skier, competitive. She's 12 years old. They're gone all the time. Oftentimes, one parent is there and the other one's off with the daughter, taking you to a ski competition or skating practice some far distance away for long periods of time. Those kinds of families have to reorganize themselves in order to make it possible for their daughter to achieve and to maximize her talents, and that's one of their constructed goals, to make sure that she does that. Right? They see that that's what she has as an ability, and they see it as their responsibility to make sure that she fosters that, and they're going to reorganize their family life in order to make that happen. Also monitoring and responding to deviations and outcomes related to goals. So it's not just making these arrangements so that certain things can happen, but just on a day-to-day basis, families have to kind of keep track of, well, how is Johnny and Janie behaving? What are they doing at school? Are they getting into trouble? Are they doing their homework? So these tasks that have to be done also have to be monitored, and they have to be regulated. Corrections have to be made to make sure that things are getting done. Well, why aren't you doing your homework? Well, because something's happening at school. Well, how can we make life easier so that you don't have those things happening that keeping you from doing it? You make adjustments. Okay? So those are some first order tasks. Then some first order tasks having to do with systemic goals are things like maintaining family themes, group identity, and personal identities. So families always have to make sure that they maintain an image of who they are. And we do this kind of automatically. I mean, we don't sit down and say we're going to be this way. But you know, you see it in different aspects of what your family does. I grew up in a Catholic family. So we always had these sayings. My mom, you know, the family that prays together stays together. Did you ever hear that? Something, things like that, right? So what it is about keeping things together. We adopt rituals. And those rituals become tasks. Every Christmas, this is what we do. You have to go shopping, to buy these presents this particular way. To go to church, you have to come home, you open a present, whatever. All of that ties into sustaining our identity as a family. And so, as we get older, we go home again. And we go home the next year, and we go home the next year, so that we can partake in those rituals. Why? Because it ties us together as a family. It sustains our identity as a family. Other kinds of tasks involve the effective internal and external, maintaining effective and internal and external boundaries. So families always have to make sure they keep people who want parts of them out of their business. They have to they know how to close off the environment, shut the door, right? And you're going to see this really clearly in Brooklyn. Both keeping people out and also sometimes within the family making distinctions. I don't know about you, but my parents never fought in front of me or any of my siblings. They were going to fight, they went into the bedroom and closed the door. Boundary. Now that's a physical boundary. But regardless of where it happened, the point is they didn't do it where we could see it. And so that social boundary is there. When the children are here, we don't fight. When they're not here, then we can have it. We can have it out. Okay? That's creating an internal boundary related to the needs of the family to sustain itself as a functioning system, because it's very difficult in a family to have a lack of boundary between the parental subsystem and the sibling subsystem. Families don't operate well when you have adults who have to make decisions for children and then have the children involved in that process without some boundary setting there. Maintenance of physical and emotional needs of members. So one of the families have to do to survive is they have to make sure their members are surviving. Family's not going to work very well if everybody's getting sick all the time. It's not going to accomplish anything. And those sick members are going to put pressures on other family members to do the tasks that they would have done. They're going to eat up resources that are needed for the family to function properly, be they physically or emotionally kinds of sicknesses. So families with an emotionally distressed member, it's very hard for them to survive. It's a very difficult task. And so what they do is they have to devote lots of their resources to deal with that member's emotional needs. And then finally, maintenance of the emotional climate. Families need to have order and they need to have cohesion. Families can't have disorganization. They can have an order that is flexible, but chaos is a lack of systemness. Chaos means that you're never going to be able to coordinate your actions. People doing whatever they want whenever they want to. And so the group itself, under chaotic conditions, doesn't exist. And then cohesion is the idea of togetherness. Something has to be holding people together. People have to see some interest in participating. They have to see some value in being part of the group. If they don't see a value in being part of the group comes under pressure of disintegrating. They'll just go their separate ways. It's got to be something that causes them to look inward more than they look outward. Second order tasks are related to managing and adapting to change, so changing the family culture and structure to respond to a change environment. And so families generally organize themselves in ways that allow them to go from day to day and to, as they see as best, to accomplish their tasks. But then something might change. And if something changes, they have to be capable of changing the way they're organized in order to adapt to that change in their environment. Someone gets sick. Well, the way we organized to achieve our goals was this person would work and this person would stay home and take care of the kids. Now the person who works gets sick. They can't work. What are we going to do now? Can we reorganize to adapt to the new conditions? That's a second order kind of task. Some families are better able to do that than others. So you could have a family that's really good on the first order tasks. They really have good structure and organization, lots of cohesiveness. They really maintain lots of order. They're very efficient at getting things done. People are generally happy with the way that they're operating as a family group. And then they encounter a catastrophe. Let's say, my sister, as an example, she lost her whole home. Like that. In Hurricane Katrina. She actually watched her house go into the Gulf of Mexico. Fortunately, she got out in time and went up on a hill to a friend's house. But then when she got up there, she watched her house just go out into the ocean. What do you do then? What do you do then? Well, without going into details of my sister's life, you can imagine some families might have been really perfectly, they might have been the perfect family before that happened, but have no capacity whatsoever to shift the way they did things to adapt to that loss. You'll see it in the movie Ordinary People. Perfect middle class, upper middle class family. 2 sons achieving in school, athletics, swimmers. They went sailing. They had a family life, a beautiful home. Parents who came to visit. Celebrated holidays. Good investments. They were zooming right along. You'd say, man, that family is functional. They lose their oldest son. Bam, they fall apart. How are they going to adapt? What did they have about them, besides the things that the way they were organized that allowed them to achieve their goals at the first order level? They needed something else. They need some other kind of dimension to their system functioning that allowed them to then move away from that and develop a new way of interacting with each other. And do they have it or don't they have it? And when we see the movie, we'll talk about that. They actually don't. Yeah.
So is the first order more of like how they kind of interact on like a daily basis and how they go about like kind of everyday things, and then the second order is like how they interact when a major change happens?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you'd have, So, for the first order tasks, it's sort of an after the fact kind of analysis, right? You'd say, well, what are the goals of this family, and how does the way in which they've organized themselves, their patterns of interaction, generated to help them achieve those goals, and are they doing it well? Day to day. Second question is, yeah, they have that, but do they also have characteristics of their interactions that if something came and interrupted their day-to-day life and made the conditions of survival or the conditions of achieving goals changed, do they have other kinds of aspects of their system functioning or structure that allow them to then change and make a successful adaptation? And some families have it and some families don't. Some families, they developed a pattern, it's working, but they can't move out of it. They're usually rigidly structured. And they can't seem to find a way to fix it. They just keep on marching along and hope that it works. Other families, they might have some of that rigidity, but they also have certain elements to their day-to-day interactions, certain kinds of communication patterns, certain kinds of decision-making structures that allow them to then, oh, okay, we understand we're going in this direction, but our conditions of life have changed, and we're capable of reorganizing ourselves. And those are the ones that successfully achieve second-order tasks. So that's the difference.
Yeah.
Families are self-monitoring systems. What does that mean? Okay. Families monitor themselves and they monitor their environments. They keep track of things. They watch. So family system monitoring is how close are family members' behaviors to the expected. So the one thing we watch is whether or not the members of the family are acting according to how they are expected or should act. So what are our rules? What are our procedures? Are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? Are the dishes getting done? Is food being shopped for? Is the laundry getting done? Is the trash being taken out on the right day, etc.? Okay? Is the homework getting done? Monitoring the children's schoolwork. So is the breadwinner going to work and doing their job properly? So this is family system monitoring. We can't keep track of that, and we try to correct it if it gets off, according to the standard patterns. The other is family context monitoring, and this is less about our members meeting their expectations, and it's more about, well, what are the environments around us that might make us necessary for us to fix something or change something. And so this is looking at what are the opportunities, constraints, and resources present in the internal and external environment. So how are we changing? Maybe someone's getting older. Maybe they're becoming more capable of doing more around the house or helping with the family more. Maybe they even need that. We have to be aware of that. We have to be aware what the members are going through in their lives, both in terms of what are the constraints that they're being placed under and what are the opportunities for us as a family to grow and develop and become something better. And it's not just the members, but also what's happening outside. So what's happening with Johnny and Janie at school? What's going on in the school system? How are the children relating to their peers? What's the wife's work environment like? How much stress is being experienced there? What are the particular nature of those stressor events? And families need to keep track of those kinds of things. And without that information, they tend not to work as well. Okay? So they don't really function well without knowing what those contexts are, because they won't understand each other's behaviors without understanding those contexts. And they won't understand what are possibilities for them in case something goes wrong, how they can adapt better. So if I know what's available in the environment to help families in need, then when I have that particular need, I know where to go. Some families do that better than others. So that's context monitoring. Both the internal context, what's happening in the lives of members, and the external context, what's happening outside the family. Mm-hmm.
Could it be like with the family context monitoring, could it kind of be like a two-way street? Because I know like working in a lot of elementary classrooms, like you see the kids that don't interact with their peers more are the ones that are having like not a good family context at home. So are they kind of like two-way streets, or is it just kind of...
Yeah, and I think that's probably behind the argument that, you know, teachers want families involved in their children's schooling. And part of that involvement is they know more, they're better able to handle that child in the classroom if they're aware of what's going on at home. And the only way they become aware of what's going on with home is if the parents are doing context monitoring. Okay. And they're getting involved in the school. And so I think that's what you mean by the two-way street? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it works both ways. Yeah. Okay. Families are self-regulating feedback systems. So when families see that something is wrong or something is better that they might want to achieve, what do they do in reaction to it? How do they make an adjustment? Are they good at that? And that's called feedback. So you monitor, say, oh, this person or this isn't living up to the expectation. What are we going to do? Right? How do we respond? That's feedback. Two kinds of feedback. The first is what we call negative feedback or deviation dampening. And a deviation dampening system You see, some of these terms, it's kind of weird, right? Do they sound kind of scientific?
Yeah.
They're kind of like electronics and rocket science. Yeah? Well, get used to it.
Okay.
Because that's what this whole perspective comes from. It actually comes from rocket science. The whole family systems perspective was developed after World War II.
Was it like kind of like atoms and stuff? Because I feel like...
Well, some of it is from biology and living organisms and understanding how living organisms adapt and develop, like boundaries. Amoebas have porous or less porous boundaries. But a lot of it is coming from military applications. So how does a self-guiding missile, we see these missiles nowadays, right? You can put them right down a chimney, right? We all saw that in the Iraq War. How do they do that? Feedback. The missile constantly checks with radar and sonar where it's located and what the environment looks like. And it's capable of, every time it sees, it has a goal. And every time something pulls it off its goal, it brings it back into line, right? And sometimes it can be catastrophic, right? So you got these great movies, Hunt for Red October. You ever see that movie?
Uh-oh.
No? Oh, it's great. They're hunting for this submarine. And they fire a missile at it, and they're able to swerve just in time, and the missile goes into some rock formation. But the missile, with this case it was a torpedo, is following that submarine. It's tracking it. It's making adjustments to its course based upon the feedback it's getting from its radar, or its sonar in this case. But the feedback system's not fast enough, so when the sub makes a sudden turn, the missile goes forward and hits some other obstacle. Or Independence Day, you see that movie?
Yeah,
what's his Will Smith, right?
Yeah,
he's in that fighter, and the thing's chasing him, and finally he swerves just at the last minute, and it goes in. Well, that's feedback that's not working very quickly, right? Okay, so a lot of these terms are coming from that development in the world of systemic, I don't know what you'd call it, mechanics or whatever. And some of it's also coming from management systems that were developed in World War II to help us better allocate troops and things of that nature based upon getting information, monitoring, and then having systems that automatically made adjustments based upon the information that came in. Started to think, well, maybe families operate the same way. Or at least maybe we can think about families using the same kind of term and then classify families based upon how well they do kinds of feedback things. And feedback might make a difference in how they adapt and how they achieve their goals. So two concepts that come from this idea that families are self-regulating through feedback. One is negative feedback, and this is deviation dampening. So someone's behavior, given the way in which the family is organized and structured, becomes deviant. It's not meeting the goal. So we have to bring it up to par, otherwise we're not going to achieve our goals. So what do? We enforce some kind of reaction that stops that deviance from happening and causes the behavior to come up to goal. We don't change the goal, we stop the deviance. Okay? And so that's deviation dampening. It creates a system, what we call morphostasis. Morphostasis, oh, that's kind of an oxymoron. Morpho, changing, stasis, not. Morphostasis, not changing. The system keeps on going the way it always has gone, and the deviation is eliminated through some suppression activity. So a great example of this would be how a child who violates the rule that he has to come home by a certain time at night and do his homework. The system then says, oh, he didn't come home, so there's no way we're going to achieve our goal because he's not going to do his homework and he's not going to succeed in school. So what do? We spank him, or we ground him, or whatever. Or we reward him if he promises to come home the next time, and then we'll give him a reward if he starts conforming. Whichever, whether we punish him or whether we reward him, isn't what's going to make it negative feedback. What's going to make it negative feedback is that the action is intended and results in stopping the deviation. The rule stays in place. You're not changing the rule. You still have to be in by 8 o'clock and then do your homework. Okay? So it's called deviation dampening.
What happens when neither negative or positive feedback works?
Okay, well, be careful. Whether it's a negative or positive reaction doesn't define it as negative or positive feedback.
Okay.
What defines it as negative or positive feedback is whether or not the way of operation, the system of operation changes or doesn't.
Okay, so what if neither of those change?
If there's no change in the normal day operation of family life, then that can only happen by stopping the deviation. So negative feedback always results in an ending of the deviation and a continuation of the existing system as it is.
Okay.
Okay? You can do that in two ways. You could, if the behavior of a member, you could punish them to stop them from doing it again. Or you could give them rewards, stop giving them rewards for conforming. Whichever way, you're not changing the rule. Johnny's still coming home at 8 o'clock, right? That's still negative feedback. You brought the system out of deviation, and you've restored the existing patterns that were there, the existing rules. Positive feedback is deviation amplifying. In positive feedback, it results in morphogenesis, so changing into a new structure. And this is usually second order task activity. Instead of focusing on doing things the way we've always done them, we're now going to change the way we do things. Because Johnny's deviation is telling us, because we're also doing context monitoring, that Johnny's in a different stage in his life and he needs more freedom because those peer relationships are also important. Or having involvement in the school is also important. And he can't meet our family rules at the same time and accomplish those tasks that he has to accomplish in those new contexts. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change the rule. Johnny starts coming home late after 8 o'clock. We're going to understand what Johnny's issues are. And we're going to say, oh, I understand. You don't have to come home at 8 o'clock. We're going to increase your bedtime till 10 o'clock. But we're going to work out a new way for you to get your homework done. Okay? What did we just do? We changed our structure. We changed our patterns, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
So that's positive feedback. So the example, negotiating changes in family rules during the transition to adolescence is where positive feedback happens the most in families. And you can almost define a family's problem with an adolescent child as a result of a family trying to deal with the deviations that come about with adolescence, because this kid is no longer a child, it's now something else with a whole new set of needs and constraints and pressures. And if the family tries to make it still conform to its family organization as if it's a child, that kid's going to be in a lot of problems, right? They can't do both. And so they're going to keep on disrupting, and they're going to be punished and brought back in, maybe pulled out of context so that they can't keep them from interacting with their peers or being involved in schools, and they're going to say, it's more important to stay and keep the family as it is. That's going to cause usually problems either for the family, because the kid's going to keep on responding to the pressures and causing more negative feedback, attempts to keep their behaviors in line with the family's needs, or it's going to cause problems for the kid, right? They're going to, I don't know what to do. I can't please both places at the same time. I can't deal with my own physical and emotional needs, psychological needs that are coming about because of all these changes that I'm going through. Kid's going to be a basket case. So what usually happens is that families are really good at monitoring. And they usually understand that children, when they get to be a certain age and they go through certain kinds of physiological changes, kind of know, and they go into high school, they kind of know what the world is like for those children. They understand what the new context is like, what the world of the peers and the school is like, and they understand what the internal dynamics of that kid are going through. And as a result, they make changes in how they operate so that that child who's now an adolescent can have this successful transition. That's an example of positive feedback. We're going to change the system. Why? Well, because we understand that there's new pressures and needs that the child's going under because of their internal dynamics and because of their external environments in which they're interacting on a daily basis. And so we make the change. Fortunately, we do a pretty good job, most families. You know, adolescence used to be called a period of storm and stress, storm and drought. It used to be thought in the turn of the 19th century that, or turn of the 20th century that you know, the early field of adolescence was all about this. Oh, this turmoil that adolescents are going through. But maybe that was true back then because the world was changing a lot and families didn't understand the things that their kids were going through in adolescence like they, because the timing of things got all off because of the Industrial Revolution. But today, we've had 100 years of dealing with these kinds of situations and families have learned. They've started to monitor more and be more sensitive to what the requirements of development are in today's world. And so they're more capable of doing this positive feedback reaction.
Do you think the Industrial Revolution had an impact on because the parents that were having kids went through that adolescent period, so wouldn't they be more sympathetic? Do you think it?
Well, having gone through it themselves certainly helped. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And so over generations, families started to get a better clue, and our culture started to change after the Industrial Revolution. As a society, we put more emphasis on understanding individual development. And we never really understood it before the 20th century. There was no field of adolescence. There was no field of child development before the 20th century. We didn't even think about those things. Kids went from kids to adults. When they became pubertal, there was no in between. And so we became much more sensitive to that, and that allowed us to make those kinds of necessary corrections. Yeah. Not so much concerned about that as we are about the dynamics. What is the difference between negative and positive feedback, at least at this point, okay? In addition to the functional components of families as systems, we can also think of the family system as having structural components. And these structural components, they relate oftentimes to the process of the family seeking its goals, but also they arise as a result of members over time interacting with each other and reacting to each other as they express their individual characteristics. So not everything that happens in a family is just about seeking goals. You've got a lot of individuals who are working together and oftentimes living together, and certainly in a highly interdependent with each other. And in doing so, they are developing sort of unique reactions to each other's proclivities and needs, etc. And so what comes of that is patterns. And as we said earlier, patterns are what we mean when we talk about structure, family structure. And so the structural components of the families, one of the first ones that will be really important for us as we go through talking about the family as a system and the different systems models and what makes systems work better or not so well, is the idea of boundaries, especially external boundaries. Okay, so we have to think that a family, at its most basic element, you don't have a unit, you don't have an organism, you don't have anything without a boundary around it, right? So you think, I'm a person. Well, where does my personness begin and where does it end? Well, sort of the skin is my boundary of who I am, right? I don't exist outside of that skin, at least as a physical organism. Everything is contained within it. Now, the skin sometimes lets things out, right? I sweat, I cry, and sometimes it lets lots of stuff in too, right? So I go out in the sun, like a beautiful sunny day, and I sit out in the sun, and what happens? I get tan, but more than that, what's even more important than that, especially for people who live in places like the Pacific Northwest?
Like vitamin D, so...
I absorb vitamins, right? And so my skin is porous. It lets stuff in and out, right? Well, families, we think of them in the same way. They have boundaries. Now, you can think, well, what's the boundary of my family? And that boundary could be physical. My house is the boundary of my family. But in some ways, that's not exactly correct. The house helps the family delimit itself, but the family may extend beyond the house. A family could exist across multiple households, right? And so the boundaries of the family are only known by the rules, basically, or the patterns of behavior that signify that you are part of the family or not part of the family. They're signified in other, and we can see different aspects of those boundaries in different ways, and different indicators of, well, what's the boundary of the family and what's happening at the boundaries of the family. So the external boundary of the family is who's in the family, who's excluded. They can be open or closed. And so an open boundary is like having, you're confined by a gate and the door is always open. Right? Things can flow freely. There's nobody watching what comes in and out. That's a completely open boundary. Sometimes a boundary can be so open that you say, well, is there even a unit there? Stuff is flowing in and out. There's no regulation. It's not an organization. It's not something that's self-contained. Usually to have a unit, a metaphysical unit that you could call a family, has to be something regulating what comes in and what goes out.
But what comes in and what goes out, do you mean like patterns that come and go, or is it like...
Okay. When we say what goes in and what goes out, systems theorists think of three different things. So matter. Mm-hmm. Like who can come in, who can go. And so physical things come in and out of the family. Families purchase furniture and bring it in. Okay? Families have members. And so people are part of the family or they're not part of the family. So, well, that person isn't part of the family, this person is. Now, how do we know which person is part of the family, which isn't? Well, that's sort of the basic thing that defines the boundary. So if you see Dennis the, you know Dennis the Menace? You know that cartoon Dennis the Menace? I don't know if you, it's about a little kid who's always in trouble, right? And he's got these two middle-class parents, and he's always doing silly, stupid things, right? And that's what's funny about it. And one of the classic Dennis the Menace cartoons is the priest is over visiting. And Dennis is oblivious to the idea that their family has boundaries. And he tells his priest what happened, in the bedroom the night before in terms of a fight between his parents or something like some stupid thing that they said that was meant to be kept in the family. But Dennis let it get out of the family. Well, in a sense, in doing that, the funny part of that is that the priest wasn't part of the family. He was allowed into the home, but not as a member. This is why it's so hard to study families. Because if we want to go in and study a family, ideally, we want to go in and sit there and watch them. So what does a family do if it has good boundaries and someone comes in and sits there? Does it act naturally? No, it shields itself, right? And so that's a kind of a way that we know who's in and who's out of the family. By what are the expectations for our behaviors towards that person as opposed to someone who's outside the family? Do we act to them differently? Do we expect different things from them? And so that helps us come up with a definition of who's in and who's out. It gets kind of complex sometimes, this idea of matter as defining the boundaries, because we have today lots of complex kinds of families, right? And so we have lots of families that are brought about through divorce and remarriage. And so now you have children who are part of two families, or are they part of one family? Right? And so the idea of boundaries has been used very considerably in the area of looking at adjustment to divorce and remarriage, especially with regard to children, and the ways in which children cross over and blur the boundaries between distinct family units, while at the same time defining an overlapping unique family. So you have actually three families in a divorce with a remarriage with joint custody of a child. You've got the new family of each parent, which the child is part of both, and then you still have a family in the sense that both parents are still responsible for the child and are coordinating their activities with relationship to that child. And many times that third kind of family, which is overlapping the other two, is excluding one of the members of the other families. And so how do you clarify those boundaries is a particular problem in these kinds of situations. And so family systems theory has been very useful in that regard because it gives us a tool to talk about this sort of ambiguity that happens and the kinds of problems that might arise because of these overlapping boundaries. The transference of information that was supposed to be kept in one family that winds up in the other family's purview. And so that's one element of boundaries is the regulation of members. Another is the regulation of information. And so to some extent, I've kind of hinted at that, who can get the information. But a better example of it would be who controls the television clicker. Okay? Who controls the television clicker in your house? In the home that you grew up in when you were still living there? Dad for sure?
Yeah. Oh no, that was all mom. She's like, that TV's
All
off, that
mom.
TV's off.
Okay.
My dad still controls the clicker.
Okay. Why is that a boundary? And actually, this was a subject of a really great talk given once to the major association that deals with the study of families, the National Council of Family Relations. Sociologist at University of Oregon talked about the television clicker as a symbol of boundary maintenance in families with regard to information flow. Because one of the places that we get information, one of the places that information can come into our family life is through the television. It's why your mother didn't let you watch certain things, right? Because the family is trying to control its cultural element, which we're going to talk about next, its values and beliefs, etc. And it doesn't want members being exposed to things that are going to in some way disrupt that cultural element, because that cultural element is central to holding the whole thing together. And so we control television viewing in a sense. When we're doing that, we're controlling the flow of information in and out of the family. The telephone. This is a big problem for families today with regard to technologies, because there should be a boundary between family and work. And there always has been until cell phones and the internet and pagers. Now all of a sudden, work's there all the time. And you could be working, you could be doing things at home, and the boundary gets broken because you're not regulating the reception of cell phone signals, which is then going to bring in information from another place that might disrupt what you're doing as a family. And so that's another example of boundaries being breached, not by someone coming in physically, but by information flowing. Another boundary element would be money. I think that's more of a matter kind of thing. Money is a resource that can be used to purchase things or to help families realize their goals. So money comes in and it goes out. Right? People earn money, they bring it into the center. How do you control that money? And how do you control then sending the money back out? Who controls that? Is there good control over it? Those kinds of issues are issues of boundaries. Okay. Finally, we can think of boundaries in the sense of energy, activities. So you work in your family. You have so much energy. Each member of the family has a certain finite ability or a set of energy to do things. Are you putting it into family work or are you putting it into things outside the family? And there's a control over that energy usage. I used to spend all my time in my neighbor's yard helping his dad build walls, stone walls. Dig holes, work in the yard. I never did anything in my house. Obviously, my family wasn't controlling the allocation of energies. Okay, we want our family members to dedicate what's necessary for the family to achieve its goals. In order to do that, we have to control the boundary with respect to where those energies are being expended. And so these are all elements of what we call external boundaries that define the family unit. They're very important because they're really critical to the family's ability to coordinate itself and to focus what it has towards the accomplishments of its goals. They're also important because families have to be able to monitor what's happening outside those boundaries. Families have to know what's going on. Remember we talked last time, when we talked about functional component, we talked about system monitoring and context monitoring. Well, context monitoring is all about having someone on the boundary keeping an eye on what's happening, having some ears in that community, going out into the school system, getting involved with teachers and teacher conferences, learning and listening and bringing that information back in. And so that's part of the boundary dynamic. Okay? And so the external boundaries. Now, as I said, they can be open or closed to varying degrees. If they're very open, we call this boundary permeability. And so, boundary permeability could be defined as the degree to which the boundaries of a family are open and unregulated. So what do you think? Is it good to have closed boundaries, or is it good to have open boundaries?
I think, can it be like both?
Can it be like both? Yes.
I know that.
Well, it can be somewhere in between.
Yeah, like can it be a mixture? Because I feel like if it's too open, then that just causes chaos and things go awry. And if it's too closed, then your family is completely closed off
Right.
to society. Yeah, you have no way of functioning as a person in society.
That's right. So you're just, if it's too closed, you're never going to have the information that you need. You're never going to have the resources that you need to really thrive and advance the family. Individuals are going to be looking inward at each other. They're never going to have external sources of expression, etc., right? So you want them to be open to some degree, but you don't want them to be unregulated. So the idea is to have a mostly open but regulated external boundaries. That there needs to be some freedom for members to go back and forth. There needs to be the ability for resources to come in and go out, information flow back and forth. The family gets value from having information come in, knowing about society, having some source of outside news, connection with society, rather than never watching any TV and listening to no radio, etc. So it's good to have that. It enriches the family's resource base, which allows them better to achieve their goals. But you don't want it to be completely unregulated. Right? A funny story, I have another colleague who had tried to regulate the information flow from television, and so he was gone and his wife was gone during the day, and so his kids came home from school before they got home, and he didn't want them watching television to get that information. He was a very, I would say strict, but a very conservative Mormon believer, and he didn't want some of these ideas that are on television being conveyed without him or his wife being there to help interpret it for his children. He wasn't going to deny them access, but he wanted to make sure it was regulated. And so what he did was he took the plug and he got this device which was a lock that you turn, and it was attached to the plug when you plugged it into the wall, and you turned the lock, and no electricity could come through. So the kids couldn't watch television because there was no electricity, because the plug to the TV had this lock on it. Until one day he came home early and he saw his kids watching TV. They had cut the cord and stuck the two wires into the... So it became a rather dangerous way of controlling the boundary in the end.
That's like how they have like the parental control thing where you can like...
Absolutely. Parental
like these, you have to have a certain password for these channels and...
Yes, yes, yes. Password control for watching television. Not necessarily you don't let your children watch things, you make sure that you're there when they're watching them, and there might be some things you don't let them watch.
Oh, yeah.
Right? My wife said she could only watch, there was two things that she was forbidden to watch growing up. She couldn't watch the Three Stooges. You know who they are? You probably don't know. And
Mary, Curly, and Moe.
Mary, Curly, and Moe, because there was too much violence, and they were stupid, right? And she couldn't watch TV evangelists, because her mother was was Lutheran, and she didn't want those other ideas coming in and competing with the ideas that she was trying to foster within her family. So she was exercising boundary control through rules. She didn't have a physical way of doing it, but those kids knew if they did watch something like that, they were going to get punished, right?
Mine was Jerry Springer. My dad was
I'm sorry?
Jerry Springer.
Jerry Springer.
That was my show. He's like,
Yeah.
don't you do it.
Yeah.
Okay, Dad.
Yeah,
As soon as they
I
leave.
think that'd be a good one. I'm sorry?
As soon as they turn their back or they leave,
Yeah.
that's a button.
Okay, so those are boundaries. And that's a very important element of the family system. It's the thing that defines where does the family begin and where does it end, and how well is it able to control its environments, right? Second is we can talk about internal subsystems in families. That families aren't just one happy unit. Families are actually more complex than that many times, almost all the time. That they consist of groupings of individuals, members, which are distinct within them. So the most basic one you think of is a parent subsystem. We always think of the image of parents. What do parents do when they make decisions? Do they sit down and see what the child wants and then sort of find a mutual agreed upon outcome? Or do parents, or is a model of parenting more one of the two parents go somewhere else and talk about the issue and then come and say, here's what we're going to do to the child? Or are they somewhere in between? And so we can think of the parental subsystem as being a separate combination of members around some activity, in this case making decisions about socialization. And then they actually build what we can call an internal boundary around themselves, right? And that helps them carry forward what they're trying to accomplish without the interference from the child, and then they provide a united front. So that's a model of parenting that reflects the existence of an internal subsystem. In this case, that would be an example of a system functioning subsystem, right? So these subsystems can be individual subgroups of individuals organized based on position in the organization, things like their age and gender, or the relationship to system functioning. So the parental subsystem is a kind of system functioning subsystem. It's there to accomplish a particular kind of goal. The parents interact with the children all the time, but when it comes to having to make decisions about the child's socialization, they separate themselves off in some degree. They shield themselves from the child, they talk about it, and then they bring a united front to the child. So that's a way of parenting. It's called the parenting subsystem. The executive subsystem often overlaps with the parenting subsystem because usually the adults are the ones that are doing it. You don't usually have an executive subsystem that includes children. That would seem kind of inappropriate, wouldn't it? Why?
Because an executive, it's not like a socialist where everyone's on the same playing field. It's like you have a hierarchy of kind of standings in the family.
Right.
And I feel like an executive member is someone that can provide either knowledge or financially, or has proven that they can take care of the rest of the group, whether it be in a family or in a structured position.
Right. You want the executive to be the one that has knowledge, the one that has skills, that knows how to make decisions, that's a capable, rational thinker, or that at least has the skills necessary to the kinds of decisions being made. And children generally don't have those characteristics, right? Adults, we usually, now, other things being equal, there are some adults that don't have those, and their children probably are better off running their families than they are. But for the most part, we generally think that adults should be the executors in a family. Sometimes in families, when there's a divorce or when it's a single parent family, you might get an executive subsystem that's an oldest child and a parent. A lot of, in my global families course, we talk about transnational families. And in a lot of those cases, you've got a parent who's living in another country working as a nanny or housekeeper or something, a caregiver, and she's got a daughter and some sons living back home, and she's coordinating with her daughter to run her family. And so that case might be an older child in combination with the parent. Although even in those cases, what that happens is in those families is they incorporate an aunt or a grandmother into their family system, and the mother who's away coordinates with her sister, and her sister runs her children for her. So in that case, the executor is the mother and the sister in that kind of a family. So you can get various kinds of combinations. I don't want us thinking of families as always being a husband and wife and children. They're not. They can be quite varied. And how do we know what they are? Well, we look at where the boundaries are. We look at the nature of the rules and the interdependencies. And so sometimes families incorporate other members into them. So the internal subsystems, they can be of this system functioning type, the executive system that makes decisions, the support system. Now, in the support system, you might have an overlap instead of age hierarchy groups. It might be an overlap with a positional organization of the family, which is gender. So who provides the supportive stuff in your family? Now, sometimes it could be the father and the mother, but oftentimes it's usually the mother takes on those kinds of responsibilities to provide support, especially emotional supportiveness. But many times that mother, another source of support will also be part of that support system will be a sister, or one of the female children, and she will be helping the mother in that regard. In my family, I have 5 sisters, 2 who are older than me, and one of them virtually brought me up. And she was someone that I always felt was very supportive to me during my years growing up. So I probably put her in the support subsystem because of unusual circumstances. When I was born, my mother broke her arm and had all these complications. And so for a couple of years, my sister brought me up. So she was actually part of the parenting subsystem, but a bit more of the supportive role. External relations, some people, who's responsible for interacting with institutions outside the family? Who goes to parent-teacher conferences? So who went to did your parents go to parent-teacher conferences in high school or grade school? No. So you didn't even have an external relation. How about yours?
Mm-hmm.
Both parents?
Oh, yeah.
So both parents were involved. But many times it's just one parent. And oftentimes, again, it's usually the woman, at least with regard to the school. But external relations in other areas, it might be
Athletics.
in athletics. Might it be? Huh?
I was
Dad.
grade checks. If your grades are okay, we're not going to parent-teacher conference.
Yes. Okay. Really?
Yeah, I mean, like in high school we had to do grade checks and everything, and even in college you have to like print out your transcripts. And if I had A's, my parents were just like, whatever. There's not your.
Oh, they would decide they didn't have to go.
Yeah, but if
I thought you were saying if your grades were bad, they didn't want to go because they didn't want to hear about it.
No, my grades were good. They're like, why are we attending?
Yeah, why? This is pointless.
Why?
Okay. So we can talk about the internal subsystems of the family, and some of the models that we're going to talk about, actually starting next time, put a lot of emphasis on how well defined are the boundaries of these internal subsystems and who's in them. And the 2 types are position, age and gender. So, I had 5 sisters and 2 brothers. We had a girls' room and we had a boys' room. And generally, families break up their organization by gender. They don't usually put a boy and a girl together in a shared bedroom. They usually have separate places at different times where girls and boys participate and act within the context of the family. And so you get a gendered division in families many times. It's not all the time, but our society is structured based on gender. Resources allocated differently based on gender. Different genders are socialized somewhat differently. They're specialized in different areas. Power is distributed differently based on gender in our society. And so all that filters down into the family organization as well. So in my family, there was a place for women after dinner on Sunday. It was in the kitchen, cleaning up. There was a place for boys and men in my family. It was in the den watching football. 2 different places. How I ever wound up loving to be in the kitchen, I don't know. But, you know, there are places that are, and it's not just, again, I don't want to put too much emphasis on the physicality, but the idea that there are subsystems based on both genders is easiestly understood using an example that shows the physical location. Years ago, I had a student did for a methods course, did her observations in a women's shelter. And she discovered that they had all these great programs during the week for the women to come and get counseling and talk about their issues. And she went to those sessions and she saw a little bit going on there in terms of women working on issues in their lives. But then she said, then I helped out with dinner and I was in the kitchen. And you know, those women were in the kitchen all the time. And when they were in the kitchen, that's where they got all their counseling done. They helped each other. That's where all the emotional supportiveness is. So in a sense, that's a reflection of their lives growing up in families in which their families were organized based upon gender, and that organization actually got expressed in a physical location with boundaries around it. Men weren't in the kitchen. Because men weren't in the kitchen, women could talk about all kinds of things, right? And so today, you know, men today might have their man caves, and that's probably where they go, right? Age is another big one. Obviously, there are things that are shared interests amongst the older generation than the younger generation. And you can imagine in a family with 8 kids like I had, we had family subsystems divided into, we had 2 brothers, I had a brother and a sister, followed by a brother and a sister, followed by me and my sister, followed by a sister and a sister. And in a sense, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sibling subsystems, 2 of which only had individuals in them. These 2 sisters hated each other. And my sister and I never did anything with our younger sister because there was a good 4-year gap between each of us. So there was nothing that we really had in common. We were involved in different things that put different demands on our family life at the same time that were incompatible. And so we were always having to negotiate in not outward ways, but we were, in a sense, negotiating with each other and with our parents for the kinds of things that we felt we needed as two individuals who shared common situations in their lives because we were the same age, or very close in age. So 1 year separating, 4 years, 1 year, 4 years, 1 year, 4 years, 4 years. And so that created these divisions in our family. And if you were to ask any of us what was our family like growing up, we'd all give you a different answer. But the answers would be kind of shared within those groupings because we lived our lives as a subsystem as a sibling subsystem going through based upon our common age, the common demands that we had at those times in our lives, and the circumstances of our family when we were going through different stages of our life. So that's a positional subsystem. We can also say that every individual in the family is a subsystem because every individual in the family is a unique psychological, biological mechanism, right? So you can imagine, here's this family trying to maintain itself, but it's got all these little systems in it. And those little systems aren't like, it's not like a machine where it's a fixed thing that never changes, right? Every individual is trying to manage its life within the context of the family life. And so they're putting pressures on families, the family system dynamics, and they need their own space. They can't be taken over by the family. They need to have that separate space. I don't know if you did this. My daughter did this. She used to put a sign on her door, keep out, private, right? Oscar the Grouch was famous, right?
Girls only.
Garbage. Yeah. Girls only, right? That was one based on gender, but you also want your own separate space. And actually we know that having good, strong internal boundaries with respect to the individuals, they can't be completely closed off. You've got to be part of the system. But individual psychological and biological systems, which is what we're saying what we are, have certain needs and have certain contingencies on their life that they need to deal with, and they need privacy to do that many times. We actually know that in adolescence, one of the biggest things that helps foster development in adolescence is time alone. Adolescents absolutely need time alone. Why? Well, because their system is in crisis in a sense. Their system is in the process of trying to figure out what it is, of being self-reflective and trying to create an identity that's not just contained within the family, but an identity that connects to all kinds of individuals and organizations outside the family. And so it needs to be some way to be able to coordinate those things, and it needs to have that freedom to do that. Can't be just kept within. And so that's the idea of boundaries. Positional boundaries, and then relationship system functioning boundaries. These are the things like the executive system, the parenting system, the support system, the external relations system. Patterns of behavior related to system goal attainment is another aspect of structure. So you have external boundaries, you've got boundaries around subsystems, that complexity, and then we can think overarching all of that, those internal subsystems, is patterns of communication, decision-making, power, affection-giving, conflict, division of labor. Families develop ways of achieving their goals. Okay? To some degree, the subsystems are there to help them achieve their goals, but then they develop patterns of communicating with each other about certain kinds of topics. Who do you talk about with respect to what kinds of topics? Who do you go to when you are, who's going to be the person, if you wanted to talk to your sister, do you go directly to your sister or do you go through your mother? That would be a communication pattern. In my family, we're all older now. I hardly ever talk to my brothers and sisters. I find out about their lives through my mother. Right? That's sort of the way communication was organized in my family. Decision making, how are decisions made, who tends to make those decisions? What are those patterns of decision making? Is it democratic? Is it top down? Is it authoritarian? Is it no decisions? Is it a family that can't make decisions? They don't have a process, a structure in place. They just sort of have chaos. They just sort of make decisions whenever they want to by themselves, not as a shared unit. Are they stuck with making decisions? I had a family, I have a cousin, and we went over to their house with my sister. My wife has a cousin, and we went over to their house once to have pizza. We were like there for 2 hours and we never got the pizza because they couldn't make a decision about what kind of pizza to buy because everybody had to be involved. And it has to be the perfect pizza. And they didn't have any process, any set of rules for, okay, here's how we make the decision about what kind of pizza we buy. I have a lot of weird people in my family. Affection given. Who gives affection to whom? How is affection displayed? What's appropriate? What's not appropriate for displaying affection? Are you a hugger family or a non-hugger family? Right? When I leave my family back home, and I just was back home visiting my brother, my mother, and a couple of my sisters and their husbands, and when I stayed with my sister, and when I left, I hugged my sister and I shook the hand of my brother-in-law. But I have a Ukrainian daughter who's married, and whenever we greet each other, we hug. And so what's appropriate in terms of how affection is displayed, how much affection is displayed, who displays affection towards whom. Those are sets of rules that develop over time because patterns evolve based upon how the members have interacted with each other. How is conflict worked out? One of the biggest ones, who does what? What's the division of labor? Who's going to accomplish all the tasks that allow the family to achieve its goals? Who's going to purchase the groceries? Who's going to cook the food? Who's going to clean the house? Who's going to put the child to bed? Who's going to take care of the child? Who's going to feed and bathe the child, etc.? Okay? Those are all parts of what we call the division of labor. And that can be very important because one of the words in there is labor. And people generally don't like to do labor. We'd rather have leisure than labor, right? And so the division of labor has implications for issues of rewards and costs, and what's fair and what's not fair, what's equitable and what's not equitable. So these are important elements of family system structure that family sociologists care a lot about and study. These patterns of behavior reflect strategies used to accomplish tasks and achieve goals. Okay? So these are broad patterns. They happen on a regular basis over the course of years, right? Finally, we can talk about patterns of micro-interaction. And these are not related to so much the achievement of goals as much as they are related to the ways in which we react to each other, independent of what we're doing, whether we're communicating, whether we're making decisions, whether we're showing affection, it doesn't matter. We sometimes develop these patterns that we can't get out of, that we don't even know exist. And one of the biggest kinds of patterns is the patterns of reinforcement. How do we mutually reinforce each other's behaviors? These we know less about because they take a lot of money and energy to study, but there's been some good studies of these in recent years. And they're usually involved between couples or at most three groupings of three individuals who are in the family. As an example I can give you is the ways in which families develop patterns of mutual reinforcement with regard to pain behaviors. And so for a number of years, I worked at the pain clinic at the University of Washington. And what we were doing is trying to help individuals who had chronic pain. And there was no reason why they had chronic pain. Oftentimes they did something at work. Many of them were railroad workers or timber industry people, and they tweaked something in their back. Or they had arm pain, or they had headache pain. And they went on disability and they tried to fix them. They tried to figure out physiologically what was causing the pain. And they went through MRIs and CAT scans and everything. They couldn't figure out what's going on. Why do these people have pain? And so the last resort was, so that they're not constantly being given money but from the state, well, we need to find a way to help them control their pain. And so they'd go to the pain clinic, and the pain clinic would try to help them deal with their pain so that they weren't totally disabled by it. Well, one of the things that the researchers that I was working with were interested in was, well, maybe their pain has become absorbed into their family dynamic. Maybe something that's going on in their families, and in particular their marriages, is in some ways creating the pain behaviors or reinforcing the pain behaviors. And so we brought couples in. One had pain and the other was the spouse of the person who had pain. And we had them talk about things. And what we did was we had them try to resolve a conflict that they had. We asked them to sit down for 20 minutes and talk about this issue and try to figure out a solution. And we videotaped them. And as we videotaped them, we watched them, how each person responded to the other. When one person did something, what did they do in reaction to it? And the hypothesis is that the ones that when the person had pain, something good would happen. And that would be reinforcing of that pain behavior. And the good thing that could happen would be you took away something that was bad. And so what we discovered was, in fact, whenever they were having this conflict, and then whenever the conflict started to increase and the spouse started to become negative, you tended to see an increase in pain behaviors in response from the person who had the pain. And then, whenever we saw an increase in pain behaviors on the part of the person with the pain, we saw a decrease afterwards in the negativity of the spouse. So if you had pain, and this happened to you in an interaction, if someone started being negative to you and you showed, I have pain, and they stopped being negative, they said, are you okay? Positive? Do you think you'd use that pain again? If things got negative again? Because you could shut down all that negativity, right? And that's what was happening. That's a micro-interaction pattern that these couples had developed because of something about one of them that then got reacted to once or twice, and then reinforced that behavior being used again, which then created that pattern over and over and over again, and they never knew it was going on. They couldn't tell you about it, but we could show them on tape. We could show them exactly what they were doing. These kinds of micro interactions happen in a lot of areas in relationships that happen in families. Oftentimes they get subsumed under the concept of communication, because it is a kind of a communication process, or under the concept of conflict. But it's something more than the general idea of how do we talk to each other and who talks to whom about what topics. It's more about how, when we're communicating, we get caught into a pattern that we can't get out of. And that's many times one of the biggest sources of relationships ending. In fact, John Gottman at the University of Washington can predict divorced couples by bringing them into a laboratory and having them talk about something for 20 minutes. He can look at their patterns of micro-interaction, and he can tell you with about 95% accuracy which ones will get divorced in the next 5 years.
Because tell him right on the spot, like, you're going to get divorced within 5 years, or does he wait and see?
No, he doesn't tell them. But he does offer them therapy, because he has a whole therapy program around how do you get couples to learn about their patterns, to see them. And by seeing them and being able to talk about them, if you make someone aware of these things, then they can do things to try to avoid them, and that's the kind of therapy. So that's another aspect of structure. It's not structure related to the pursuing of goals as a family unit, but it is a kind of structural element that happens whenever you bring people together into close interdependency over time. That they're going to have individual characteristics and individual reactions to each other that have nothing to do with the system dynamic, but might get in the way of that system functioning properly. And so that's where we talk about structure in the micro level. Finally, there are cultural components of families. Families have what we call myth and meaning systems. Okay? What is the reality of our day-to-day lives? What are the meanings of behaviors or symbols that we use? How did your family, do you think of your own families? Do you think of anything about how you saw family life that you think, well, you know, we saw ourselves this way, but maybe not everybody else did? Did you have a sense of who you were as a family? Or what the reality of your day-to-day life was, is what I'm trying to get at.
So like our family, like my family life was always really hectic. Like we were never not on the same page, but there's 3 girls.
Mm-hmm.
So there's 3 of us always running around doing our activities. And everyone else saw us as completely on top of everything, always on time, punctual. And we were just like, oh, what are we doing today?
Okay, so your reality of your day-to-day life was hectic.
Yeah.
But in fact, there may have been an organization there.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if that.
Okay.
I don't know what I would say. I would say like our day-to-day lives, like it was only really me that did any athletics, so that part was easy. I'd say it was very, I want to say the way that we viewed our family was stressful, but everyone else thought we were like really happy, really a good family together.
Yeah, that's usually the case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that happened in your families where you know that it was really not true? That you, as a group or as a set of certain subsystems in your families, had constructed a reality that wasn't actually true?
Yeah, it's like other people.
Like we were happy, but we weren't really.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You just put on a face.
Yeah.
My parents would say it all the time. Look happy. You get home, you'll be okay. Look happy now.
I think the better example of this would be if I went and thought about the reading that you had for today. Did you get to the Hochschild reading? If you didn't, you should do it, because it's a really great chapter in her book, and we'll talk at greater length about it after on our next segment. But it's about this family, and they have defined their reality a particular way. They believe that one of the things that is influencing him is the fact that, for example, his mother was a mild alcoholic who basically kind of ignored him. And so that's the reason why he acts the way he does in his family today, why he expects his wife to do all the work. It doesn't make any sense. It's a theory about why we work this way. A bigger one is they have this myth that they are sharing the division of labor, that they're doing equal amounts around the house, even though she's doing twice as much as he is. This myth is sustained by an idea that she has half the house, she has the upstairs responsibility, and he has downstairs and outside. So it's 50-50. Well, what's downstairs is the dog, hobbies, the garage, tools, you know, things that are kind of fun and not really demanding. And what's upstairs? Things that have to get cleaned every day, cooked every day, washed every day, right? And not really fun no matter who you are, although many women have a meaning system of housework that it's rewarding. Not anymore? Many women will tell you, I do the housework, but that's okay because I get a lot of rewards out of doing housework.
I can see that, but the only problem now is I have 3 roommates, and it's not rewarding because I'm like, I didn't make this mess. Like, why do I have to clean it? I like cleaning my room because then it's gorgeous. I'm like, oh, look at this, it's vacuumed, it's clean. But then I get to the downstairs and I'm like, no, I'm not gonna do this.
Yeah. Not my problem.
Yeah. Those are your dishes that I'm saying for 2 weeks.
Well, in families, that doesn't happen as much. Maybe with roommates, but not so much with families. Because families have to live with each other for a longer period of time. You don't leave the roommate, right? It's harder to leave the family. And so oftentimes, many kinds of interpretations of what family life is like and what the realities of the situation are distorted in order to maintain some sort of semblance of togetherness and peace so that you can work together to achieve goals. And so this is the myth and meaning systems of families. It's part of the culture of families. Cultures are all about symbols and the ways in which symbols are used to make sense of things. And so that's part of this. We also have many times special kinds of behaviors or symbols that we use that only members of the family understand. Do you have any of those? Is there anything that you do that no one else understands? That, yeah, but everybody in my family knows that. There was once a set of twins, I think they were called the Kennedy twins. And they grew up and they developed their own language. They could interpret things that each other did and said, and their parents had no clue. Because they had such a clear boundary around them that they spent so much time together that they actually worked out a system of meaning that they were the only ones privy to, and their parents didn't know.
Is that kind of like body language? Like, I know when my mom or my dad stands a certain way, or if they like anything like that, or if their face looks a certain way, like I'm automatically like, okay, I'll be outside, where other people are like, what's going on? And I'm like, no.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be spoken words. It could be any kind of action, any kind of behavior. So nonverbals are the big way that it happens.
Yeah,
right?
Then with that, my family has a lot of that.
Have a lot of that, right?
Yeah, like just, I don't know.
Certain looks.
Yeah, like my dad, as soon as I see his brows furrow, I'm like, oh, I'm leaving. Or anything. Or my mom, if she like says, oh, really? When my mom says, oh, really, that's like a grenade.
So how does that happen? That it's because over time, you've spent so much time together and had so many situations in which that behavior or phrase was uttered in that particular way, that phrase takes on meaning. And so communication is a pragmatic thing. Whatever it results in is what it means, right? So, oh, I don't know what that means. Oh, but I do. Because I know what it brings about.
Yeah.
Right? And so that only happens if you interact in close proximity and with a lot of investment with the other person that you're interacting with over time. And that's what families are about. That's what makes families so darn interesting. and so darn potentially explosive, right? Because these things, they have this high level of interdependency and they have duration, and that provides the opportunity for these cultural elements to evolve. They have their own systems of meaning. Another cultural element is beliefs, values, and ideologies. What do we believe in? And this has a lot to do with how we prioritize things. And so, what, think of your family. Does your family have certain beliefs and values and ideologies that are kind of shared, and that there's an expectation that we will share these things?
My family's pretty split, I think.
Okay.
I mean, like, my mom is Catholic,
Uh-huh.
and then my dad's Protestant, and then I'm Christian, and so,
Uh-huh.
and then my sisters are whatever they are.
Okay.
But
So you don't have a really strong
going-
central...
Yeah, going to church or like
Yeah.
anything like.
But it doesn't have to be religious.
Yeah, any beliefs like that, I don't know, I'd say we're more founded on moral, like, what is the good person supposed to
Okay, so what is a good person? It's non-religious, but it's a
Yeah.
belief and value system about what is appropriate behavior in general for
Yeah.
people to engage in.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine was the same way. My mom was very liberal and she was agnostic. My father was very Catholic and very Republican, and you could just see the division. Like, my mom wouldn't let him vote Republican because she's like, we just cancel out. So,
Right, so those values and beliefs and ideologies, they exist within the family system. They might be, and you can imagine how the family dynamic might differ if you've got two people who share the same set of values and beliefs versus those who don't. So you might have, my mother was Catholic, my father was Protestant, non-religious. My mother was liberal, my father was conservative. Yeah, we lived together, but in some ways it restricted the interactions in some ways. You avoided certain things because of these circumstances, In my family right now, my wife and I are both very liberal, so we had this joining kind of element that very much defined our family. We have a very central set of values and beliefs premised on a liberal political ideology. We're both Protestants. I used to be Catholic, but we share the common religion. And that's a lot of reasons why religions like their members to marry people from the same religion. And it's a lot of reasons why couples, when they get married, they find a common religion. It might not have been the religion of either to begin with, but they find something that they both agree upon. Because it helps give a little bit more definition to what you're about as a family. Helps define the culture a little bit stronger. You could define yourself as agnostic, or you could define yourself as eclectic, right? As, people have the right to believe in what they want to believe in, and we have a common set of moral ideas, and that's what we promote. Whichever way, it's still part of the belief and value system of the family. It's part of the culture. Third is rules and norms, what behaviors are appropriate, both generally and position-specific rules and norms. And this probably, again, it ties into the values and beliefs and ideologies. So you said a strong moral code. What's appropriate behavior? What's inappropriate behavior? It could be appropriate, inappropriate, more generally speaking, like never bite people. Right? You see the soccer match the other day? Yeah, Uruguay versus Italy, I think it was. And this guy goes up and he takes a chunk out of the shoulder of this other guy.
Oh no.
It's like the fourth time he's done it in his career. He's been, he's been banned from soccer for periods of months on end for biting people. We're talking about this with my daughter this morning, and she's, I guess he never got taught the principle that you shouldn't bite people.
Yeah.
That's sort of a rule. Don't bite people, right? Treat the people as you would have them treat you. These are kinds of rules and norms that families develop that regulate the behaviors of their members generally, and sometimes it could be position specific. Well, you're not old enough to do that. Okay? You're this age, so you do these kinds of things. Your brother and sister, they're older, they get to do these kinds of things. So we oftentimes reflect the age hierarchies by having specific kind of sets of rules for different members. And then identities. Who are we as a family? How do others view us? And this is part of the meaning system, but it's more specific about who we are. And so we're a happy family. We project that to other people, right? When I was growing up, I was a racetrack family, which was kind of important to my family in terms of how we saw ourselves and how we interacted with the world and how we interacted with each other. We were the ones who were separated from the rest of society. We were on the horse track. Horse racing was not thought to be an appropriate kind of activity. It involved gambling. And so in my hometown, we were sort of on the outskirts. But we had a lot of fun, and a lot of that fun revolved around being a track family. And we knew other track families, and that created a connection, et cetera, right? And it became part of our family life. We had pictures of horses on the walls. My brothers were involved in the track industry. And so it was who we were. And I have to say, growing up and thinking about it, it was pretty important that I be that person, that I be a member of that family. It made my family make sense to me, who we were and what we were about. It helped me deal with how other people may have treated me when I was outside the family. I understood them better because I understood who we were, and I had a good sense of that. And so we had kind of that strong notion of being a track family, although it was kind of split when I came along, because my mother kind of took control of my family once I came along, and we then became an education family. And so everything was focused on education rather than being stuff around the racetrack, because my dad had been older and he was no longer as involved the way he used to be. And so I had the horse track family, and then I had this other element of our identity is that we valued education. And my mother tried to find people to hang out with who were educated, and also our social class standing. Where are we in the social class hierarchy? So I don't know, do your family have an identity?
Yeah, we were the softball family.
You were the softball family.
Like literally, my sister traveled. We both played softball and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So her and my mom would go one way, and then my dad and I would go another, and then my little sister would just pick who she'd want to go with that weekend.
Right.
But we were gone every weekend from probably May till August, September.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see how these identities
Yeah.
can really influence the nature of your family life, right? Lots of time apart, lots of probably very autonomous, loose family structure, right?
Yeah.
Because you were trying to serve the identity. That's what was really important, or had evolved to become important. Right?
Yeah.
So that's sort of our identities. Who are we as subsystem units? So spouses and siblings define themselves uniquely. So, like I gave you an idea of the identity of my family. When I look back on it, there was my parents, and there were my two oldest siblings, and then these other two, and then there was us two, and then there was this and that. That was more than just a sociologist analyzing my family. I actually felt that when I was growing up. That, my sister and I, we were a unit, and we were different than the other ones that went before us, right?
Do those sibling units, can they change and morph as
Yeah.
you grow up and get older? So
Yeah, and that's the aspect of a family, when we talk about a family as a living system, right? It's a living system, which means it's changing. And so, yeah, they can, yeah. And then how do we view each other? What do we expect of each other? And this aspect of identity has to do with who are we within that family. So as I said, I go home, I'm Ricky. I'm still that favorite, right? I can't ever get rid of that. My identity developed in that family. So you develop a character, which is who you are, even outside of the family to some degree. But within the family in particular, that's who you are. And many times we give names to those people. We give special names to designate those identities, right? To bring and invoke all those meanings, all those kinds of expectations of how you should act. And so that's part of who we are, and that's part of the culture of the family.